The reality is the machine should not ever replace you. It should complement you. And by taking off that first layer of anxiety around the technology, I think we could all benefit from the use of the technology and allowing us to actually go and focus on more critical, impactful things.
Welcome to the Team Amplifier Podcast. I'm your host, Byron Summerdahl. Here you'll be inspired by industry leaders who build flourishing tech teams. Stay tuned and prepare to be amplified.
3, 2, 1.
Today I'm with Paul McRae, and we're talking about letting your team work on more interesting things. And we'll unpack that in just a few minutes. But I want you to meet Paul. Paul is a fractional CTO specializing in healthcare. He's been in it for a long time, and he really understands healthcare and technology and everything in the gap between more than anybody I've ever met. And he's also, surprisingly, an avid gardener and landscaper. So whenever he gets finished with all of his people work and tech work, he likes to get his hands dirty and get outside and build things. And that's close to my heart as well, because I love the same thing. So Paul, how about you tell us more about yourself and what you're doing these days?
So, thank you, Byron. Right now, I'm running a fractional TTO practice focused on healthcare systems. And I say it in that way because I think that the majority of healthcare systems in the country that we are well familiar with, the HCAs, the Kaisers, Intermountains of the world, are being targeted by the large SIs, solution integrators, consulting firms. What I've done at this point in my career is redirected a lot of my experience and solutioning strategy and pointed it towards the systems within our community that would be most impactful should they collapse. And so when you think about rural America, which is generally speaking the majority of the United States, many of those areas rely heavily on smaller health systems that are out economically running in a difficult way. And what I wanted to do at this stage of my career was to shift my focus on making things better for those who need help. And so what we've done is we've developed a fractional CTO practice focused on modernizing the environment, utilizing the data, optimizing the workflows, and ultimately creating a better experience for not only the clinician, but patients as well.
That's awesome. You've got your plate absolutely full. I'm interested to hear how you are growing yourself. You're spending a lot of time helping everybody else, but as we know, as leaders, we have to be reading and expanding our own selves and investing in our growth. So what's a book that you've been reading lately that has made an impact on you?
You know, there's a book, Healthcare Digital Transformation, and it's written by the former CIO of Cleveland Clinic. I've been him and Marks. And Ed is pretty prominent on the podcast scene as well, but it talks a lot about the implementation of digital technology within the care environment. And having known Ed for years prior to him launching his books and getting out on the social media podcasting, it was really interesting to see how he's evolved in his appreciation for technology in the environment. And so I find that, as we begin to look at the operational components of healthcare, running the business, and the outcome, clinical components of healthcare, there's a unique blend of technology and operations that needs to occur. If only for the cost of care being so high. Most health systems run single-digit margins. Being able to utilize technology in the care setting helps both the patient and the clinician to operate in a more efficient way and potentially even produce better outcomes for the patient as well.
That book is a little bit outside of my normal reading list. So, mostly because I'm not really in the healthcare space. I started out in the healthcare space because I used to work for HCA years ago. Actually, I owe a lot of my career to them because they gave me a chance to learn some things in the road. So thank you, HCA. But yeah, I haven't had a chance really to be in that space but it seems like there's just a lot to learn in the healthcare space that maybe the rest of us take for granted, wouldn't you say?
I would say that, what's interesting about healthcare is that it's just more or less become a common understanding that the margins are so tight. However, what we're facing in most recent years is a declining, what I'll call traditional work population. And this means the mom and dad worked at big corporations for years, had standard insurance available to them. The entrepreneurs operate in a much different environment. So now we're looking at a world in which the healthcare system is being funded by privatized organizations, higher cost, and in some scenarios, no insurance at all. So the more that they have to rely on what I refer to as public payer programs, Medicare, Medicaid, the more difficult it is to become financially viable and sustainable in terms of providing services. And so utilization of technology in healthcare, care delivery specifically, is paramount to the survival of the space. And so this topic today is, I find very interesting, because when you place technology into an environment with high value, high frequency individuals, incredibly intelligent clinicians, business leaders, it's sometimes perceived as a conflict of interest. And so what I'm really interested in talking about today is how we can actually move the anxiety away from the technology itself and actually being able to emphasize the importance of technology benefiting both the clinical team as well as operations.
So everybody out there, you can hear that Paul really knows his stuff, and he talks a good talk. But Paul has also told me about some of the softer parts of his upbringing in tech leadership. And Paul, it's confession time. Tell me about an embarrassing mistake that you've made as a tech leader, just so that we can be sure that you are a real person, real human being, right here on this show.
Well, I've honestly been accused of being a little high octane at times. And so oftentimes that leads me to make some very bad assumptions. And I had a client that was in the Midwest, and there was an obvious need to discuss moving to the cloud and some of the benefits from cost reduction and optimizing the way in which they run their business. And so I jumped probably 2 or 3 chapters further ahead. And I walk in, it's always a good thing to meet with someone in the C-suite. We were meeting with the CIO. And we began to talk about the utilization of technology, how it would benefit their business, and data collection and data analytics and utilization and optimization of costs. And after I stood there and gave my pitch of 10, 15 minutes or so, the guy said, well, that's great, but I got nobody on site that uses the technology or knows how to use the technology. Why don't we start there? And so it's a huge shock to really stand up and kind of put your best foot forward and then be politely informed that you completely missed the mark and needed to, take a couple steps back. It turned out to be an ice-breaking moment for the CIO and myself. It allowed us to humanize the engagement, but then realize that we needed to really take in consideration that the industry as a whole, generically speaking, could benefit from the implementation of cloud technology. However, the amount of resources within the care delivery setting that have that experience is quite limited. And so it was a very good moment for me. Fortunately, the CIO was a very generous and pleasant guy to give me another shot at the conversation. And it allowed me to kind of recalibrate on where I needed to start my conversations going forward.
So you get off the plane, you get into the boardroom or the conference room, and you're talking to the CIO, and you say, so we're going to be able to pass all of these things off to your tech team, your cloud team. And he looks around and he says, what cloud team? Is that basically it?
Even better than that, getting off the plane, racing through the car in a full-on sweat, showing up at the client site, starting the conversation in clearly the wrong space, and then have them tell you that we have nobody on site. So take the whole story and realize that at times, I've been forced to pivot on the spot.
Yeah. Well, teaches you to think light on your feet, right? We in leadership, we sometimes have to even fake it till we make it. Like maybe hope that they didn't notice that we forgot that or didn't that we didn't know about their lack of cloud. So let's talk about the theme of the day, which is, you said it a little bit differently, but I'm calling this letting people work on more interesting problems. So help me unpack this concept so that our audience really understands what we're talking about. What do we mean by letting our team work on more interesting problems? Like what problems are they working on that need to be elevated or upgraded?
So I'll give you an example specific to data analytics. And in today's world, data is king. Data-driven decision-making is found in every industry and every vertical. Specifically in my space of healthcare, it's paramount to running their business more efficient, both clinical operations as well as running the health system itself. And so by really talking about technology, it creates a level of anxiety that one oftentimes lands on, and what does this mean for my job? A perfect example is being able to take the outputs of this data analytics exercise and being able to exercise things like, what type of procedures should I be working on? What type of patients should we be serving better? What communities are in need of our service? However, it could take months, multiple quarters to collect the data. And so using technology to relieve them of the minutia of actually pulling data together, creating reports, and allowing them to actually execute on the more interesting things, the delivery of community services, the support of patients that need additional guidance, education options, and being caught up in an environment where there's limited. I always say that no one is sitting on the bench in healthcare. No one's sitting around looking for things to do. And so if you've got a team dedicated, as an example, to patient population health, improving the health of a specific set of patients, and they're doing 50% of their time actually aggregating the data, that's a gross abuse and use of their time. Where when I think about today, and we're still all, including me, getting familiar with how technology is optimizing the way we work. Even as simple as using an AI tool on your computer at home to create notes, write documents, etc. Being able to understand how the technology should become a part of the workflow and not replacing the workflow is a real key component, specifically in healthcare. So that example alone could yield outputs like, we need to be doing more of these types of procedures. We don't need to be doing these types of procedures. We need more of this kind of data so we can make a more informed decision. And being caught up in the analog effort of collecting data, creating spreadsheets, blending the data is obsolete. And so in my mind, when I read your question, let them work on more interesting things, that's a very simple example to me. If you can deploy your AI agent to go out and collect the data you need, there's still a human component involved on the other side of the conversation that says, yes, this is good. No, it's not. It's a system to complement the systems that are in place, with the human element being a part of that system.
Yeah, and especially with the tools that we have these days, there are far less excuses to have people continue doing what they used to make me do in a previous company, where I would get to some days actually develop applications, but then other days I was the guy that was stuck having to go through this process because there was no app, no system that was able to do this. Like it had something to do with cleaning up a comma separated value file, fixing the data there, making sure the columns were aligned, and then doing other things like, I remember actually having to take copy, paste from some sort of spreadsheet into another app because there was no integration between the two. And
Right.
And here I am, they're paying me, I don't even know how many, well, back then it wasn't a whole lot per hour, but it was enough that they could have probably, because they had me doing that for 2 years, not like daily, but every now and then, at least once or twice a week, I had to go and do this super boring, like you say, high anxiety. I call that boring, but I was bored out of my mind doing that kind of stuff. But now, I mean, they could have just put me on the task of creating an integration or an app that would move the data. Now we have far less excuses because we have more tools that can do it just without even having to work hard for it. A non-developer could even create some of those integrations.
Over the last 10, 15 years, I've kind of changed my talk track. I remember when I first started speaking around mobile technology in healthcare, and I was at a conference in Washington, And I presented a question to the audience and I said, when you go to the bowl game and you stop at the ATM to get some cash so you can buy a beer, do you think there's a little man standing in the box and says, here's your $20, Byron? No, there's not. Now go back 20 years before that, you never would have expected to get money out of a gas station. The reality is that as time evolves and keeps pace with technology, we have to expand our level of comfort. And so being able to utilize technology for those mundane tasks, those things that we know can be automated, that's really going to change the calculus and way we run our business. I would see the first response would say, it's going to remove me from a job. The reality is that your employer, whoever it may be, should be evolving you for the next job and being able to point you into a place where you can get trained up and use skills to elevate your own occupation, your own profession. I've seen this happen in a multitude of ways. We really want to talk about the electronic medical record system. There was a lot of anxiety around the Affordable Care Act and more or less requiring healthcare providers to digitize. The reality is, when my father was a physician, he'd go to visit in his office and there were racks and racks and racks of patient files. And if someone said, hey, when's the last time you saw Paul? And oh yeah, by the way, what values did you have for X and Y? We're talking about 2 or 3 days, maybe, if it gets into cycle, because I'm sure that was not the first time somebody asked that question. And so that means that now we've wasted, let's call it 3 days, 24 working hours, 3 8-hour days in a row, trying to find some information or wait on some information. And so being able to implement this technology, i.e. the electronic medical record, optimize the way in which healthcare providers were offering services, providing details. We're still in an evolution phase. And so having used that conference I spoke to, or I mentioned at the top of the statement, I would say now the conversation is not about, hey, get up to speed. We are doing this now with this technology, such as in the case of an ATM, but more so now, it's not a question of whether if the technology can do it, it's how the technology is being applied. That's the key component. And with that being said, our IT leaders have evolved. One would argue that in the early days, someone who wore the title of CIO within the health system was really no more than a data manager or a guy who pulled cable 5 years, 10 years before that. Now we have a need for resources in any industry for that matter, who have the ability to not only worry about keeping the lights on, the machines running the systems, but also forward thinking on how to implement technology and integrate it into the workforce and the workflows that are a part of or specific to that industry.
Yeah. So as tech leaders, no matter what industry we're in, I think that it's important as we are trying to move towards systems that help people. Like I can tell people all day to work on things that are more interesting, but it's on me and on the designers of the systems that our developers and our teams are actually integrating and using to leave some sort of breadcrumbs or some sort of way to integrate. So as I design a system, if I'm a product owner, I've got to not only work on the UI so that the user can actually click through and use the product, but I also need to be thinking about how can future developers integrate into this system so that if they're not creating new situations where somebody like me has to come in with a developer's salary and copy paste, and then we're back into the same kind of boring, anxiety-ridden work. So as tech leaders, we need to be thinking through how can we build in integration points. And then also on the other side, we have to be ready to consume integration points and know the mechanics of how systems have to work together and what's the glue that goes between them.
That's a very interesting call out because, and I'm trying not to get too deep into healthcare, but a great example of that dynamic is a protocol called HL7. HL7 gave you the ability to exchange healthcare data. HL7 as a code has been around for over 30 years, and it never was consumed. We now are much closer with FHIR, FHIR, and now we have the ability, to your point, to not only produce FHIR-based solutions, but also encourage developers on the other side to write FHIR-based code so that they can begin to utilize it. And that has happened over multiple decades, but we're getting closer. We are moving at a snail's pace, but we are getting closer.
Well, I'm glad to hear it because I've had to write a few applications that actually had to parse that stupid HL7, and I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. Back when I was writing with HL7, there weren't like packages and libraries that would just do it for you. I had to write the parsing myself. And what was worse was back then, there wasn't enough standardization. So one system might produce an HL7 and it didn't follow the exact standards. And there were little differences that would still require somebody to go through and clean up the stupid file before it could be processed. And it sounds like, thank goodness, things are moving in a direction that would set people up for success more when they're actually trying to integrate these healthcare systems.
I agree. And I think it's really, getting familiar with the technology that's available. It's about sequencing. I talk to my clients now about let's work backwards. That's a Jeff Bezos thing, AWS. Look at the problem and work backwards. But when you start to look at how you can holistically approach your training challenges, your embracing technology challenges from your workforce, being able to start at a point that eliminates some of the anxiety around it really is one part compassion, one part taking away, acknowledging that the other individual may not necessarily feel comfortable with what's going on.
So we've been talking a lot about the technical side of things, the leadership side of things, but just like what you were kind of getting at there, let's shift over to human flourishing, which is the overall theme of this podcast in the first place. What does letting our team members work on more interesting problems have to do with human flourishing?
I think that you touched upon a little bit when you're just talking about the minutia of having to cut and paste and move files away. And so, unfortunately, and I've been in those jobs, my roles myself, through college and somewhat afterwards, and that, when you start to show your workforce that they actually matter beyond just clicking a keyboard, it matters in the sense of how can I help you be better? A common phrase used in the workforce today is servant leader. Being able to understand what their long-term goals are, being able to understand, where they personally feel gaps is a huge piece of it. And so when I think about the opportunity with artificial intelligence for data collection, as an example, in a lot of scenarios now, the businesses are being run from the perspective of data-driven decision-making. That's a very, colloquial, common phrase that you may hear. But in order to actually do that, there's a lot of work that has to be done with integration, data acquisition, normalization, and then ultimately being able to utilize the data. And so the heavy lifting from a brain power perspective comes on the other side of the conversation once the data has been aggregated. How do I begin to execute on what I've got from a reporting perspective? In healthcare specifically, do I need to be providing more of those procedures? Do my patient population need X or Y? How do I begin to facilitate that? However, as I think I mentioned early on, there's not anybody sitting around looking for things to do in healthcare. So if you could imagine your data team being less than 10 people, and 2 or 3 of them are spending hours and hours scrubbing spreadsheets, think about the benefit of AI technology in that workflow alone. Think about how important that worker would feel now that they're actually doing something impactful, like helping the system to decide which procedures, which services are they're short of, which services they may not need to do anymore, when they should actually have the ability to add or have the need to add clinical teams. I mean, everyone has kind of heard the concept of traveling nurses. Great idea that they're available, but they're also very expensive compared to having staffed workers. So if you had your data that said in the month of October, we start to see more patients coming through the ED, the emergency department, because of upper respiratory infections, that means next September or August, my data would start to tell me that this is going to happen. But if my team is 6 months behind because they're doing spreadsheets, think about the value to the system from an operational perspective, but think about the value to the individual from a pride perspective to know that they actually have implemented a solution. So being able to pull them away from the minutia of scrubbing spreadsheets that artificial intelligence can do, and then allowing them to actually make an impact and offer value to the end game, that is an example, in my opinion, of where you can actually show value to the individual and humanize the work that they're doing.
That's an incredible point. And what you mentioned were actually two groups of people that begin to flourish when a tech team is focusing on more interesting problems. A, if you're solving more interesting problems, you mentioned it's just you have more dignity. It is playing to your strengths. Like we are human beings, we are creative. We can solve really important problems if you give us the chance. But if we're stuck in spreadsheet land, or if we're stuck in like monkey code that you just like copy paste all over the place, then you can maybe never get to work on the really interesting problems, or maybe they're so delayed that the project itself gets canceled. Who knows? So as a practitioner, as a developer or a tech team member, when I work on more interesting problems, I feel better. Like you said, I feel better. I feel like I've made an impact. That's huge. The second group of people that impact from whenever I get my hands on a better problem, a really interesting problem, is that the people that problem impacts now begin to flourish as well. Because now, instead of an antiquated solution that they have to kind of hold their nose and just go and use, now they get to use a new system that actually solves problems in better ways, leveraging new technologies, leveraging new ideas and thoughts. Yeah, this is letting people work on, or finding a way to let people work on more interesting problems is a game changer.
It is. And think about this, I'm a very faith-driven individual, and, I believe that there's good in everyone. And so people, let's say 95% of people don't go get jobs to be slackers. What happens is that they're expected to come and join a team. Oftentimes they're told on how important they will be, and then they're stuck in a closet flipping pages, looking at spreadsheets. That individual, from a productivity and efficiency perspective, ultimately would begin to decrease to the point where either they'll be fired or they'll quit. Think about the wasted amount of training, the wasted amount of poor production that you were paying for, whether it be salary or hourly wages. At the end of the day, being able to get to a point where you can blend the two, technology and human goal, human pride, human respect, self-respect, value. I want to feel valued. If you can do that for your workforce, just that alone begins to elevate the quality of work that you're getting from your team. So I'm a firm believer that,
So why do you think this is kind of like an afterthought for a lot of people? I mean, and maybe in the healthcare industry, this is still an afterthought. And I certainly hope that people aren't in the same position that I was 30 years ago, where I was having to kind of like copy paste all the time. Hopefully we've progressed beyond that. Maybe we have, maybe we haven't. You tell me. But like, why aren't more leaders focusing on letting people work on more interesting problems?
If you ask the leader, they would say it's a time issue. And if you ask someone who is IT leader, they would say, and arguably an arrogant way, that they're supposed to know. But the reality is that we just have to apply a different lens to the same problem. Leadership above, say, your CIO, even the CEO of any entity, could be the board, it could be, private equity group, etc. And so their rhythm becomes financial goals, financial driven. Got to get to this point because that's what they're asking for. It's the flip conversation that actually matters. I see oftentimes in this industry where, the professional world in general, that servant leader has become a talking point. And I think it's much more than just the thing of the month or the thing of the year to say. And the reality is that, what I've enjoyed in my career is when a leader has come to me and said, what do you want to do? Where do you want to go? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? And that conversation yields a much different kind of production from my own work ethic, because now it seems at this point in time that they actually care about me. There's a lot of value in that, and we oftentimes blow it off, dismiss it, maybe that's a better word, because of time, because of metrics, because of goals. And the reality is that you're hurting yourself from a production perspective by not humanizing the actual other side of the conversation. The workers that you committed to doing the work, what do they actually need? Do they want to go get trained? Do they want to go do other things? Do they want to be perceived as valuable? How do you begin to address those dynamics within your workforce? And many of our workers will tell you it's about time commitment and deliverables. And we kind of take that thing off the list. We take that thing that we see as not as valuable. And the reality is that everybody has a role. And I oftentimes speak when I'm talking strategically to my team or to different clients or partners in sports terms. There's only one basketball on the court. Everybody can't shoot at the same time. There are some that rebound. There are some that play defense. But the coach who puts those 5 guys on the floor will tell you everybody has an important role. It's the same thing within the work environment. The individual who's doing the spreadsheets today, the question should be, hey, what do you think you could use to help you get that done faster? And just asking the question in itself begins to show that you actually care about that individual and care about their own human state. And that's something that I just don't see as common as it should be in today's world.
So let's inspire people to start trying to go down this road more intentionally. Because I can understand how if you just coast through your leadership journey, you may not fall into this position. You may not fall into the habit of letting people work on or finding ways to help people work on more interesting problems. So can you share about a time when this led to unexpected results for you or your team?
I myself have run large teams within enterprise organizations. And oftentimes when new technology or new processes are suggested, there's an extreme, and that's putting it mildly, negative response. With sales guys, business development guys, they don't want anything that's going to disrupt the way they do business. And so I think one of the things that we as leaders should always do is attempt to look at it subjectively from the other side of the conversation. Find out what the anxiety is that's driving them around the use of technology. In this particular case, we were implementing a new CRM system, and it was going to require a whole lot more things to be done by the individual. But at the end of the day, it gave them a whole lot more information about running their business. And so being able to actually offer them some tools that their first response was, I don't want to do this, I don't need to do this. And then being able to remove some of the anxiety around it and build trust in them, them to build trust, or me to build trust with them. It started off with, how does the technology make you feel? Where does the anxiety come? And I think if you take a step back, you can apply that type of dialogue to technology implementation in any industry, in any environment. Because the suggestion, and I'll use artificial intelligence again, that because I mentioned it prior, is that the machine is going to replace you. The reality is the machine should not ever replace you. It should complement you. And by taking off that first layer of anxiety around the technology, I think we could all benefit from the use of the technology and allowing us to actually go and focus on more critical, impactful things.
So, Paul, let's give our audience something that they can just launch themselves with. So if there's one thing that tech leaders should do tomorrow or today, like right now, in the next 5 minutes, to promote team flourishing, what would it be?
I think that we're all moving at breakneck pace. I'll reemphasize the point I previously made about, understanding the concerns and the challenges being voiced by the team. It's not something that should be responded with. That's the way it is. Deal with it. It should really start with understanding where the impact is on the employer, impact on the employee, and then being able to blend the two in so that everyone actually understands what's the intent of the project, the technology, the solution, whatever it may be. If we could all have more personable conversations, humanized discussions around technology in the workplace, I think we as a country could really benefit from removing some of that anxiety.
So what do you think? Get the team together, and what should we say? What should we ask?
What's keeping you up at night relative to this decision we've made? How can we make you feel better about it? And let's have a discussion around what you think you need to be more comfortable with it.
Love it. Sounds like a fabulous meeting to have with our team tomorrow. That's a hint to everybody out there in the audience. Let's have that meeting tomorrow. In fact, just go ahead and get on your calendar right now, schedule it up, and send out the agenda and lock it in so that you can't weasel out. Just go ahead and get this started. Love the idea of working on more interesting problems. I've been shouting that every time I hear somebody say that AI is going to steal my job. And I mean, that may happen to some, but if that is probably going to happen to some because all they ever get to do all day is stuff that the AI could do. But AI and all these other new tools that are coming out are going to elevate our problem solving, elevate our access to real problems that are interesting. And so I love the idea of being more intentional about trying to expose our teams to more interesting problems. Paul, this has been a very interesting conversation, and I'm excited to see what it does for the community. Thanks for your time today.
I did enjoy it. Thank you very much, Byron.
This has been another episode of the Team Amplifier podcast. Thanks for joining us. Now, get out there and be a team amplifier.